The Civil Research Institute, headquartered here in Monticello. As Jackie mentioned earlier, Ms. Seabrooks, I have the privilege of serving with her and Sylvester Peck on the Cemetery Restoration and Preservation Association, and I'm the current 2025-2026 Teacher of the Year for Jefferson County. So I have the opportunity of working with her. Thank you. I have the opportunity to work with a number of our local students. I'm going to give this talk starting off first from the perspective of an archaeologist. The first thing I'd like to talk about is some of the characteristics of the historical cemeteries here in Jefferson County, and then talk about how that became a substantial part of my research and my work here locally. So let's dive in with the very earliest part of the cemetery sites here. This, to put it in perspective, is where we are right now. Jefferson County borders Georgia here in the north, the Gulf here on the south. It is in the area that was known as Middle Florida and is the center of Florida's plantation belt, which means that prior to the Civil War, this is one of the centers of plantation agriculture in Florida. I'm, as an aside, personal aside, I'm a native Floridian. My family has been here for 8 generations now with my nieces, nephews, and daughter. But I grew up down in an area of central Florida that doesn't have quite the same level of earlier agriculture. As a matter of fact, where I live was within, well, what was the Seminole Reservation at that point. Here in Jefferson County, you've got a landscape that is perfect for cotton agriculture, which means that this is one of the centers where you see pre-Civil War plantations growing up. And one of the things I noticed in doing work or research at historical sites in this area, at cemetery sites in particular, when you're looking at African American cemeteries, there are certain specific characteristics that, as a broad general rule, even if you don't know much about the direct history of the cemetery, you can understand that it was likely begun or likely continued during certain periods of time. In the earliest phase of things, which is from 1826, when you see the first American settlers on a larger scale in this area prior to Jefferson County becoming Jefferson County in 1827, all the way on up until 1876 and the end of Reconstruction, the antebellum era, Civil War, they're in there. You have most African American cemeteries that date or at least begin to this period that are associated with plantation sites. Generally speaking, you're looking at a situation where enslaved people on the plantations had areas that they chose to bury their dead. In a number of cases, you have a situation where the plantation owners have a cemetery, and immediately near that, or immediately associated to it, is an African American cemetery that was the enslaved workers for the plantation. One of the classic examples of that is Bellamy Cemetery up in the northeastern part of Jefferson County. When we were doing an updated survey, we recorded the African American cemetery as a separate site because it's outside the landowner's walls. When you're looking at African American cemeteries from this period, the most common marker you're going to see is unmarked burial trenches. In many cases, the enslaved people here might have buried their dead with wooden markers or otherwise. An interesting factor is that this area also, many plantations had brickeries of their own because brick was manufactured here locally. And you will find that even where there are not marked burials, that frequently you're going to see associated brick crypts down below the surface. And you have also, interestingly enough, in this period of time, the rise of the ancestors of the first pallbearer societies. Sylvester Peck has done extraordinary research on the pallbearer societies. I highly recommend his published works on that. But the first known association that I have been able to document from members of the local community is a group of 9 men associated with the Casa Bianca plantation that organized with permission of the owner of the plantation to choose areas to bury their dead, and that became the answer to the Springfield Pallbearers Association. What you see at these types of sites where you have things that are associated with the enslaved people who worked there, a little difficult to see in this picture, but you have here an area of about 2 acres at this site, which we recorded as HA 2143, the Springfield Pallbearer Cemetery, that has unmarked burial trenches. They're very neatly laid out, side by side by side. Most of them do not have any type of surface marker, but they are still very clearly visible in the area where these woods have grown up. And in the center of the site, you have an area that is still maintained that actually belongs to the next phase of history here that I'm going to talk about. One interjection I will make here, having heard the criteria for the National Register. As someone who has been working here with these sites, we may need to consider the fact that even if you have modern burials in a cemetery, the question is, does that automatically negate the fact that it is a historical site? Because at this site and others like it, you have burials from the 21st century alongside of burials that may be 200 years old, and you have documented direct family and historical connections between the people there. So that simple criteria of, well, no, you have modern burials there, regardless of the number, may not be accurate, because here in Jefferson County, many of these sites have been used for a very long period of time. Now, in the period after Reconstruction, you see the rise of the pallbearer societies. The pallbearer societies were basically, as Sylvester has documented, fraternal organizations, although not exactly the way you would think of with a fraternity. They're, of course, associations that were created by African Americans during the period of legal segregation after the Civil War in the 19th and early part of the 20th century as mutual aid, where people would pay a certain amount of money on a regular basis. The pallbearer society would guarantee that there was a parcel of land where the burials could take place, and there would be at least some kind of a marker. Now, as an archaeological characteristic in this period, you're going to see, generally speaking, concrete vaults, flat vaults that may be unmarked or may have stenciled markers on the surface. In some cases, you may have associated monuments that may be marble. And in the early 20th century, when you see African Americans joining, for example, the U.S. military during World War I and going up into World War II, you may see markers that are marble that are military markers. This is a situation where they had access to markers that you might not see otherwise. In the time after the Civil War, in the same area where the enslaved people had lived before the Civil War, communities chose to stay many times in the same areas. You have families, you have churches, you have other organizations that build settlements that are associated with the older plantation sites, even when the plantations themselves no longer existed. As Jackie mentioned, the cemetery in the north part of the county that she mentioned, which we documented as one of several Mount Zion cemeteries. It's recorded in the Florida Master Site File as Mount Zion 2. You have 20 acres that was deeded by the plantation owner, and you have the plantation owner and his family buried in one area. The remaining 20 acres, you have African American families that buried their dead and that continue to bury their dead, in some cases, at that site. Another example here in also northeast Jefferson County. This is Jeff and Lucy Brown. This is them at their homestead around 1900 with other members of their family that you see here. And you have at that site here still flat concrete vaults. You can see that you've got some modern stuff that's been added to it. You also have in western Jefferson County, near the Leon County border, the old Mount Zion family cemetery. And this area here, you see that you've got the same thing. You've got flat concrete crypts. In some areas, though, you have unmarked burials, because as with some of the other sites, this site began as a site that was used by enslaved people. And Tom Harmon, who is a member of the board of the Osceola Research Institute and is our GPR expert, has been out there, and we have documented a substantial number of unmarked burials on one side of this cemetery. Now, third phase of things you see beginning around 1950, when you see the rise of the civil rights movement, the eventual end of legal segregation and economic shifts. In this area in Jefferson County, frequently you're going to see continued use of these existing sites, whether they're the oldest types of sites, ones that were founded during the second phase. One thing that you may see is the use of refurbished or added markers to older burials. For example, I've seen many times in many of the cemeteries here where you have a concrete crypt that is pretty clearly a pallbearer crypt, and you will see a stenciled name on the surface. And then you will see family members come along several generations later, and they will add a more modern marble marker to memorialize the site, or to add to, for example, a veteran's tomb or others. You see continued association with the pallbearer societies and churches. Springfield Pallbearers Association, Reverend James Thompson, who is the head of that pallbearer society, is the one who was able to document the fact that this association has been around since prior to the Civil War, and their society maintains 4 sites in this area, or at least 2 parcels of land, one of which has 3 cemeteries on it. You also have continuing long-term community awareness of these sites. I regret that I was not able to see Dr. Jackson's keynote address this morning, because again, in diving into this as an archaeologist, when I began doing the work on these cemeteries, this is an example of a site that is still in use. This is the Casa Bianca Cemetery, or Casa Bianca 1 proper. It's immediately south of the Jefferson Schools bus barn on Highway 19. Down here is open to the public. This is associated with New Bethel AME Church in the northeast part of Jefferson County. One of the things associated with this site is the Gallen family. You have multiple generations of veterans, and you have burials or crypts that began as simple trenches or as pallbearer crypts that now, as you can see, have added markers or monuments where family members have added there. One of the striking ones of this one is Ms. Dilsey Gallen, centenarian. You can see here, born in 1840 and passed away in 1955. So you have some folks buried at some of these sites that their lifetimes cross all 3 of the phases of times that we've talked about. And that is the next thing that I would like to talk about or to mention. One of the things that I'm glad to see at this conference, and one of the things that I've heard mentioned multiple times, is the need to reach out to the community and the need to involve the community. I would take that a step further. One of the things that I found, the reason that I began doing work on the historical cemetery sites of Jefferson County, is back in 2019, we were commissioned to try to record all of the sites here in Jefferson County. 2 of our board members, George Cole and David Ward, had been collecting information about these sites for years, and they had placed this information on our website in a format that was searchable, and they were wondering why more people didn't know about them. And I said, well, you know, the problem is that if they're not recorded with the master site file, there's not any way for people to know about them unless they happen to hit our website. So you wind up with a situation where I began recording these sites, and it was in the course of that that I had the opportunity to meet Jackie and find out about her hobby, which I didn't think was unusual at all, which I thought was a very, very great thing to have, to meet Sylvester. Also to meet folks like Reverend Thompson, the gentleman I've been talking about here, Mr. Thomas Glenn, the gentleman you see over here on the right, who was the keeper of the new home, or not new home, excuse me, who was the keeper of the Old Mount Zion Family Cemetery. And also in the course of teaching, I have students, an unusually high number of students. I see names on the burials here, and their last names are the same, and it turns out that they're descendants. I have one young lady that her grandfather was a custodian at the school, and because of her and also because of her grandfather, we were able to record a site that's out in the eastern part of Jefferson County, the Mays Williams site. One of the only marked burials out there is the young lady's great-grandmother. Another young man I work with, his great-great-grandfather is not only interred at Casa Bianca, but he was one of the freed people on one of the freedmen's contracts, was also a soldier in 1870 in the first African-American militia units in this area that protected people's right to vote under the newly passed 15th Amendment. So Jefferson County cemeteries are a critical part of our history for a couple different reasons. And for one thing, this area has not been as significantly developed. You don't see some of what you see in other areas of Florida where the cemeteries have been paved over. There's been damage, but the vast majority of the sites here in this area are in the same locations where they were originally created, even when there has been damage to the cemeteries themselves. The second thing is that you have extraordinarily deep historical roots here. As Jackie talked about earlier, I see my time is up, give me a few seconds longer, particularly since the other folks ended a little bit earlier. The fact of the matter is that you have families here in modern day Jefferson County whose ancestors have been here since before the Civil War. And their families have been using and reusing not just the cemetery sites, but the associated historical sites, in some cases churches, and other organizations that have been around that long. So they're not, even if they're not actively being used, abandoned. People in the community know about them. People in the community remember them. They're a part of the active landscape of memory that exists in this area. And last but not least, as a professional archaeologist, we tend to think the professionals, or at least we're trained to think about, we have research we want to do certain work at these sites. I submit, especially when you're looking at sites like the sites here in Jefferson County, these cemeteries, you have to kind of reverse that. You have to think about the members of the community, these are their sites. These are their families, this is their heritage, this is their history. As somebody who is a relatively new resident of Jefferson County and a professional, instead of saying, I'd like you all to be a part of my research, I think that the question should more be, I have certain skills that I might be able to apply to things that you want to know. What would you like to find out about the past here? What would you like to know? What would you like to learn? And placing the community and members of the community in the driver's seat is, in my opinion, the only way you can do work as a professional on sites like this. You have to know what the families want, you have to know what the people of the community want, and you have to provide the resources that let them answer those questions. Thank you, appreciate you letting me go over just a little bit.